Walk into a government liquor store in Ontario or Quebec today, and you will not find a single bottle of American bourbon, California wine, or Kentucky whiskey on the shelf. Not one. That shelf space has been empty for more than a year. And according to the White House's own numbers, the result has been an 81% collapse in American alcohol sales to Canada in just 12 months. This is not a story about Canada losing a trade war. This is a story about a trade war that appears, by the government's own data, to be landing harder on American producers than on Canadian ones. And now those American producers are the ones asking President Trump to change course. To understand how strange this moment is, you have to go back to where it started. On February 1st, 2025, the Trump administration opened a trade confrontation with Canada that combined tariff threats with repeated public suggestions that Canada become the 51st state. That combination, economic pressure layered on top of a challenge to Canadian sovereignty, did something tariffs alone rarely do. It turned an economic dispute into a matter of national identity for tens of millions of Canadians. And Canadians responded not just through their government, but through their own purchasing decisions and, more consequentially, through the decisions of their provincial governments. Here's the part that matters most for this story. In most of Canada, liquor is not sold through private retailers the way it is in most American states. It is sold through provincially owned and operated stores, a system similar to the ABC liquor stores found in some U.S. states. That detail turned out to be a powerful lever. Beginning in March 2025, 8 of Canada's 10 provinces and territories used their control over those liquor shelves to pull American wine, beer, and spirits entirely. No debate in a legislature was required. No new tariff schedule needed to be drafted. The provincial liquor authorities simply stopped placing orders for American product, and American bottles disappeared from Canadian shelves almost overnight. The scale of what followed is not in dispute. It comes directly from the White House's own fact sheet, released alongside its most recent tariff action. According to the administration's own figures, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages fell by roughly 81%, a drop worth about $582 million. Comparing March 2025 through February 2026 to the same period 1 year earlier, that is not a slowdown. That is the near total loss of an export market. Other sourcing tells a similar story from a different angle. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, the trade group that represents American spirits producers, known as DISCUS, has reported that U.S. spirits exports to Canada fell by more than 70% during the first 10 months of the provincial bans. Reporting from the Globe and Mail, citing an industry coalition, put the drop in U.S. wine exports to Canada at 78% between 2024 and 2025, translating into $357 million in lost export value from wine alone. And separate reporting has cited a 91% decline in U.S. wine sales to Canada since 2024, underscoring just how central the Canadian market was before this fight began. Why did losing Canada hit American producers so hard? Because Canada was not a minor market for U.S. alcohol. It was one of the largest. Reporting drawing on U.S. trade data shows that from 2022 through 2024, Canada accounted for roughly 35% of all American wine exports, more than 15% of American beer exports, and as much as 13% of American distilled spirits exports. For decades, that access was effectively guaranteed by geographic proximity and by tariff-free trade arrangements going back to the original North American Free Trade Agreement. When it disappeared, it did not disappear gradually. It disappeared within roughly a year. This is where the American industry itself starts speaking directly into this story, and where the phrase, "producers want Trump to act," stops being a headline and starts being something you can trace to named individuals. Chris Swanger, the head of DISCUS, has been publicly and repeatedly critical of the approach Washington has taken. When new tariffs were announced targeting Canadian goods in response to the provincial boycotts, Swanger issued a statement calling the retaliatory measures from Canadian provinces extremely disappointing and counterproductive. But he did not stop there. He also directly addressed the American side of the fight, warning that imposing new tariffs on Canada deepens trade tensions and raises the risk of further retaliation at a time when many U.S. hospitality businesses continue to face financial hardship. His message to policymakers was not a call for more pressure. It was a call, in his words, to pursue a negotiated solution that restores market access for U.S. producers. In an earlier statement, Swanger went further, urging the administration to, as he put it, work toward fair and reciprocal zero-for-zero tariffs for spirits products. That is an American industry group on the record, asking its own government to de-escalate, not because Canada has been generous, but because the current approach is measurably hurting the businesses it claims to protect. That is the core tension behind this title. And it is worth pausing on before we go further into the news of the past few days. The same tariff war that was framed as pressure on Canada produced a retaliatory response, the alcohol boycott. that has, according to the U.S. government's own numbers, inflicted more visible damage on American exporters than the original tariffs inflicted on Canadian ones. That is what Canada just turned the tariffs around means in this story. Not that Canada holds all the leverage, but that the retaliation Canada chose landed with real force, and the people now most publicly asking Washington to change course are American business owners, not Canadian officials. Now, to the news that has actually been unfolding over just the last several days, because this story did not stay still while we were researching it. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump escalated again. He invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law that, according to legal analysis from the trade law firm Wiley, had not been used or even seriously threatened in nearly a century. Section 338 allows a president to impose tariffs of up to 50% on a country found to be discriminating against American exports. Trump signed 3 separate proclamations that day, each targeting a different sector: alcohol, motor vehicles, and dairy. According to those proclamations, Canada was found to be discriminating against American producers in all 3 categories. Through the provincial alcohol boycotts, through quotas and tariffs Canada applies to American-built vehicles, and through Canada's dairy supply management system, which limits how much American dairy can enter the Canadian market. The dairy and auto pieces of this deserve their own explanation because they are frequently folded into headlines about alcohol and lost in the process. On the auto side, the White House's own fact sheet states that from April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles fell by approximately 22%, a decline worth roughly $6 billion, compared to the same period a year earlier. The administration's explanation is that Canada applies tariffs and quotas to American-built vehicles that it does not apply to vehicles from other countries, and that Canada structures those quotas in a way that pressures American automakers to build vehicles inside Canada rather than export them from the United States. As American vehicle exports to Canada fell, exports from other countries into the Canadian market rose to fill the gap, which is precisely the kind of substitution effect that trade economists watch for when a country loses preferential access to a market. The new tariffs Trump ordered under Section 338 were sweeping in scope. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, they apply to nearly $20 billion in annual imports from Canada, about 2% of the $382 billion in total goods the U.S. imported from Canada in 2025. And critically, according to the trade law firm Wiley's analysis of the proclamations, these new duties apply even to goods that would normally qualify for duty-free treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA or, in Canada, CUSMA. In other words, the fact that a Canadian product complied with the existing free trade agreement did not exempt it from these new 50% tariffs. The White House did carve out some exceptions. The new duties do not apply to Canadian energy, potash, critical minerals, or goods already covered by separate sector-specific tariffs like steel, aluminum, and copper. What was actually on the list, according to reporting from Al Jazeera, based on a White House fact sheet, is a genuinely wide net. Wine, hockey sticks, cement, dairy products, swimming pools, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, and even wigs, among many other categories. Later summaries from Canadian business groups, including the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, broke the new tariffs into 3 separate lists, one covering dairy products like milk, cream, and whey, another oddly labeled motor vehicles, despite containing no actual cars, covering everything from electronics and telecom equipment to building materials like lumber, plywood, and cement, plus plastics, packaging, clothing, footwear, toys, and cosmetics, and additional coverage of industrial equipment. These tariffs were scheduled to take effect 30 days after the July 20th proclamations, meaning a deadline in mid to late August. That deadline is where the story turns from background into breaking news. On the evening of Tuesday, August 18th into Wednesday, August 19th, with the new 50% tariffs due to take effect at 12:01 WEA. Hemisphere Eastern Time, President Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, that he was pausing the tariffs. I have paused the 50% tariffs against Canada that were scheduled to kick in tomorrow morning for a 3-day period, based on the fact that Canada and the USA, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal, he wrote. According to reporting from NPR, this came less than 2 hours before the tariffs, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, ranging from hockey sticks to tongue depressors, were set to switch on. A separate White House proclamation stated that the pause was granted because Canadian negotiators had expressed a commitment to remove the measures Washington considers discriminatory against American alcohol, dairy, and motor vehicle exports. But a deal and finalized documents turned out to be 2 very different things. As of Friday, August 21st, the day negotiators were racing against a new deadline, no final agreement had actually been signed. According to CNBC's reporting from that day, trade officials had emerged from rounds of talks on Wednesday and Thursday in Washington, D.C., without a final deal in hand. Canada's minister responsible for U.S. trade, Dominic LeBlanc, told reporters, Thursday, we're very close. We continue to make progress, and we're going to stay here and do the work that's necessary until we get to that point. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, remained locked in talks with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer through Thursday and into Friday, according to that same CNBC report. The stakes of missing this deadline were spelled out clearly by CBC News, which reported that if no deal was reached by the midnight Eastern deadline, tariffs of 50% on what CBC described as $28 billion worth of Canadian goods would take effect. That figure differs somewhat from the roughly $20 billion figure cited earlier by the White House and USTR, a discrepancy this script will flag honestly rather than paper over, since different outlets appear to be measuring slightly different baskets of goods, and the exact scope shifted as negotiations continued through the week. So what is actually on the table in these 11th hour talks in Washington, D.C.? According to Bloomberg's reporting, which cites people described as familiar with the matter but who were not named or authorized to speak publicly, the tentative framework under discussion would lower tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 50% down to 25%, and would cut the tariff rate on Canadian-built vehicles and trucks from 25% down to 15%, with an exemption tied to American content in those vehicles. CBC News, citing two industry sources, reported separately that significant progress had been made specifically on softwood lumber, with those sources saying a deal could eliminate the existing 10% Section 232 tariff on Canadian softwood lumber by September 1st. It is worth being precise here. None of these terms have been confirmed by an official, on-the-record government statement as of this reporting. They come from sourcing describing ongoing negotiations, not from a signed and published agreement. If you are watching this after that midnight deadline has already passed, the final terms may look different from what is described here, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. The steel and aluminum piece of this deal deserves more attention than a single number, because it sits on top of tariffs that predate this specific dispute by years. Canada is the largest single supplier of both metals to the United States, providing close to 1/4 of all American steel imports, and according to data compiled by CBC News from Statista, almost 60% of American aluminum imports. Roughly 90% of everything Canada produces in steel and aluminum is sold to American buyers, which means tariffs on those metals cut in both directions almost immediately. Ottawa's response to the original steel and aluminum tariffs was to impose its own 25% retaliatory tariffs on specific American steel and aluminum products, measures that, according to reporting compiled by Crypto Briefing, citing people familiar with the talks, remain in force today and had been projected to extend into 2026 and 2027 absent a new agreement. What negotiators are reportedly discussing now is not simply a flat tariff cut, but something called a tariff rate quota, or TRQ, a mechanism that would let a certain volume of Canadian steel and aluminum into the United States at the lower 25% rate, or potentially even less, in exchange for Canadian commitments on production volumes or other concessions. None of that framework has been finalized or officially announced. Prime Minister Carney has been explicit, according to reporting from Wealth Professional and other outlets covering the talks, that he does not want metals treated as a standalone issue. His position, as described in that reporting, is that steel, aluminum, autos, and softwood lumber all need to move together as part of one comprehensive agreement rather than being resolved piecemeal, a negotiating stance that raises the stakes of tonight's deadline, since a partial deal covering only some sectors may not be acceptable to Ottawa at all. Agriculture has emerged as its own flashpoint inside these talks, and it is a clear example of the two sides describing the same negotiation in contradictory terms. According to reporting compiled by Indexbox, citing the Wall Street Journal, President Trump has stated publicly that Canada agreed to eliminate tariffs on American agricultural products as part of the emerging framework. But Canada's own trade minister, Dominic LeBlanc, speaking to reporters in Washington, indicated that Canada's supply-managed farming sector, the same dairy system named in the original Section 338 proclamations, would remain protected rather than opened up in the way Trump described. That is not a small gap. It is two governments, in the final hours before a deadline, publicly characterizing the same set of talks in different ways, which is itself a signal of how unsettled the actual terms remain, even as an announcement may be imminent. It is worth remembering, too, that this specific standoff over steel and aluminum is not the first time these two industries have been at the center of a Canada-U.S. trade fight. Similar tariffs date back to Trump's first term, and Canadian officials and business leaders have been here before. Peter Warrion, an economist with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, has pointed out just how tightly integrated North American steel supply chains have become, noting that a single sheet of steel produced in Hamilton, Ontario, can cross the Canada-U.S. border as many as 5 times before it ends up as a finished part inside a car. That integration is precisely why business leaders on both sides of the border, including steel executives in Ontario, have consistently pushed their governments toward negotiation rather than escalation, arguing that tariffs on intermediate goods like steel sheet do not simply punish the other country, they raise costs for manufacturers on both sides of the same supply chain simultaneously. If you want to understand just how fast this situation has been moving, and how much is genuinely still unresolved even as this script is being written, that alone is worth subscribing for. Because whichever way tonight's deadline breaks, the terms of North American trade are being rewritten in real time, and the next update on which industries win and which absorb new costs could land within days, not months. The politics surrounding these talks are almost as important as the tariff numbers themselves, because a deal reached in Washington does not automatically become policy in Canada. Under Canada's system, alcohol distribution is controlled by the provinces, not the federal government in Ottawa. That means Prime Minister Mark Carney can negotiate terms with Washington, but he cannot unilaterally order Ontario or Quebec to put American liquor back on the shelf. According to reporting from the Spokesman Review, all of Canada's provincial leaders had reportedly agreed to Carney's request to end the boycott, according to Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Tony Wakeham. But as of Thursday, August 20th, the country's 2 largest and most consequential provinces, Ontario and Quebec, had not publicly confirmed that position. Ontario's Liquor Control Board is one of the largest single purchasers of alcoholic beverages in the world, which makes its position enormously consequential to the outcome for American producers, regardless of what Ottawa signs. Some provincial leaders have made their resistance to reversing course explicit and public. British Columbia Premier David Eby said bluntly, "There's not a chance in hell that U.S. alcohol is going back on the shelf in British Columbia," a comment reported by CNN. That single sentence captures how far apart federal negotiating positions and provincial political reality can be in this fight. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew struck a different, more combative tone toward Washington itself, saying Trump was very weak, and that Canada had, in his words, got the upper hand, and that Trump was back on their heels, a characterization of the negotiating dynamic that is his own political assessment, not a verified fact, and is worth hearing as one voice among several rather than as a neutral description of who is winning. On the other side of the political spectrum inside Canada, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has taken a different line, according to reporting from BNN Bloomberg, repeatedly urging Carney not to take a bad deal and invoking Carney's own campaign language about being elbows up against the United States. That domestic pressure matters because it constrains how much Carney can concede in Washington without facing a political backlash at home, even if industry groups on both sides of the border are pushing him toward exactly that kind of concession. Public opinion data adds another layer that complicates any quick resolution. According to polling from Abacus data reported by Global News, a strong majority of Canadians in some provinces want the alcohol restrictions to remain in place regardless of what governments negotiate. In British Columbia specifically, 72% of respondents said they wanted the ban on American alcohol to stay. Abacus Data's CEO, David Coletto, said those results suggest provincial governments have, in his words, considerable public room to keep American alcohol off their shelves even after a federal deal is reached. That is a genuinely important wrinkle in this story. Even if Ottawa and Washington sign an agreement tonight, the actual return of American wine and spirits to Canadian shelves may depend on political appetite inside individual provinces that current polling suggests is not there yet. There is also evidence the boycott reshaped consumer habits in ways that will outlast the dispute itself. Quebec's provincial liquor distributor, the SAQ, reported in its annual results a 4% increase in sales of what it labels Origine Quebec products, alcohol made within the province. A shift, CNN reported, was tied directly to the fallout from the American boycott. Paul Goulet, who heads Quebec's micro-distilleries union, told CNN that the trade war had contributed to what he called an unprecedented sense of unity across Canada, and suggested the disruption might ultimately push Canada to diversify its trading relationships, rather than simply waiting for American access to be restored. Whether or not you agree with that framing, it points to something concrete. Even a fully signed trade deal now competes against 15 months of Canadian consumers and retailers, building habits and supply chains that do not include American alcohol. Regaining that shelf space may prove harder than losing it did. Zoom out, and this dispute sits inside a much larger and more consequential negotiation that has been running in the background the entire time. The United States and Canada, along with Mexico, are bound together by the USMCA, the successor to the original NAFTA, and that agreement was due for a 6-year joint review under its own terms. According to analysis from the law firm Blake's, the United States did not agree to extend the agreement for another full 16-year term following that review, instead pushing it toward a system of annual reviews that injects ongoing uncertainty into North American trade rather than the long-term stability the original agreement was designed to provide. That decision is part of why this specific dispute over alcohol, autos, and dairy cannot be separated from a bigger question about whether the entire architecture of North American free trade will look the same 5 years from now. There is also a legal dimension worth flagging honestly, because it is unresolved and likely to remain unresolved for some time. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, the law Trump invoked in July, had gone unused for roughly a century before this year. According to reporting from NBC News, legal challenges against these tariffs are considered all but certain to be filed, given how novel and untested this specific legal authority is in a modern trade context. No court has yet ruled on whether this use of Section 338 will hold up, and that legal uncertainty sits on top of the political and provincial uncertainty already described. In practical terms, that means even a signed political agreement between Washington and Ottawa does not fully settle the question of whether these tariffs, or Canada's underlying retaliatory measures, are on stable legal ground going forward. It is also worth remembering the sheer scale of what is at stake in this relationship overall, because the specific dollar figures in this dispute, $20 billion, $28 billion, are a small fraction of the total picture. According to reporting from NPR, the United States and Canada sold each other roughly $880 billion worth of goods and services last year. Even the White House's own figures describe roughly 85% of Canada-US trade as remaining tariff-free under USMCA exemptions as of last year, according to background compiled in public trade war timelines. That context matters because it means this fight, however dramatic the headlines, is happening around the edges of an enormous, still largely intact trading relationship between two economies that remain deeply interlinked, from the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, to supply chains in the auto sector that cross the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. Here is where this story gets genuinely more complicated than a single headline can capture, because not every American industry named in this dispute wants the same thing from Washington. While the alcohol industry has been publicly pushing for de-escalation, the American dairy industry has taken almost the opposite position. When Trump signed the July 20th Dairy Proclamation, the National Milk Producers Federation and the U.S. Dairy Export Council both issued statements praising it. Krista Harden, president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, said the administration was standing up for American dairy farmers and manufacturers eager to make full use of the market access commitments Canada made under the trade agreement, adding, "For far too long, Canada has intentionally misused its tariff rate quota system to impede the full use of USMCA dairy quotas." Greg Dowd, identified in reporting from Capital Press as the Export Council's president, put it even more bluntly. Canada simply cannot continue to discriminate against U.S. dairy farmers by effectively blocking negotiated access to its market. That is an American producer group explicitly wanting Trump to keep the pressure on, not ease off of it, the opposite instinct from discus in the alcohol fight. The dairy dispute itself centers on Canada's supply management system, which sets production quotas and fixed prices for Canadian dairy, poultry, and egg farmers, and which Trump has criticized for years as, in his words during his first term, amounting to tariffs as high as 270% on some products entering Canada. American groups argue Canada has not fully honored the tariff rate quotas it agreed to under the existing USMCA agreement. Canadian dairy groups dispute that characterization directly. The Dairy Farmers of Canada, in a statement reported by BNN Bloomberg, pointed out that American dairy exports to Canada actually grew substantially under the current agreement, from roughly 423 million Canadian dollars in 2019 to 6 billion Canadian dollars in 2025, a 150% increase, arguing that figure undercuts the claim that Canada's market is effectively closed. Jaime Castaneda of the National Milk Producers Federation pushed back on that framing in reporting from the agricultural outlet DTN, arguing that raw export figures don't capture the full picture because not all American dairy product that enters Canada necessarily stays there for direct sale. Both sides, in other words, are citing versions of the same trade data to support opposite conclusions, which is often, as one analysis put it, a sign that a disagreement has become as much about leverage as about economics. For Angus McKinnon, a seventh-generation dairy farmer in Coaticook, Quebec, just 10 kilometers from the U.S. border, the dairy tariff news landed differently than it did for the industry associations issuing statements in Washington and Ottawa. Speaking to CBC News, McKinnon said Canadian dairy farmers are paid at the farm gate under the supply management system, meaning the direct financial impact of new American tariffs would likely fall first on the distributors and processing side of the industry rather than on individual farms like his. He said he had been expecting Washington to eventually target Canadian dairy for close to 2 years. So where does that leave the specific claim in this story's title? That American producers want Trump to act. The clearest, most direct evidence is the alcohol industry's own public statements, made not by Canadian officials, but by Discus, the American trade group representing distillers whose sales into Canada collapsed by double-digit percentages within a single year. Their message has been consistent across multiple statements spanning many months. Negotiate, restore access, avoid further retaliation. It is echoed less directly by American automakers watching a 22% drop in vehicle exports to Canada, and by the softwood lumber and steel and aluminum interests on both sides of the border, who, according to CBC's reporting on the current talks, are watching closely to see whether tariffs on their sectors get cut as part of whatever framework emerges from this week's negotiations. What we do not know, and what genuinely remains unresolved as of this recording, is whether tonight's deadline in Washington, D.C. produces a durable agreement or another short-term postponement like the one issued on August 18th. We do not know whether Ontario and Quebec, the two provinces that matter most for the alcohol dispute specifically, will actually lift their boycotts even if Ottawa signs something in Washington. And we do not know whether the reported terms circulating through Bloomberg and CBC sourcing, the drop to 25% on steel and aluminum, the cut to 15% on autos, the possible elimination of the softwood lumber tariff, will survive contact with the actual signed text, assuming a text is signed at all. If you have been trying to follow this trade fight through scattered headlines over the past year and a half, you already know how quickly the terms of these disputes can shift. A pause becomes a deadline becomes a 3-day extension, and an extension becomes another round of overnight negotiations. Staying subscribed is genuinely the only practical way to catch the moment this settles, one way or another, without having to piece together a dozen conflicting headlines after the fact. Let's be precise about what is confirmed and what is not, because that distinction matters more in a fast-moving story like this one than almost anywhere else. Confirmed and sourced directly to the White House's own fact sheet, and to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the 81% collapse in American alcohol exports to Canada, the 22% drop in American vehicle exports to Canada, the nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods covered by the July 20th Section 338 tariffs, and the use of a tariff law untouched for roughly a century. Confirmed and sourced to Discus directly. The trade group's own public statements urging the Trump administration toward negotiation rather than further tariffs. Confirmed and sourced to CNN, Global News, CBC, Bloomberg, CNBC, Al Jazeera, NPR, and NBC News. The timeline of the August 18th pause, the shift to a new deadline, and the ongoing talks in Washington, D.C. as of this week. What remains unconfirmed, contested, or simply unresolved? The exact final terms of any deal, since the specific numbers on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber come from sourcing describing negotiations still in progress rather than a signed agreement. Whether Ontario and Quebec will actually end their alcohol boycotts even after a federal deal, given public polling suggesting many Canadians want the boycott to continue, the discrepancy between the roughly $20 billion figure used by the White House and USTR versus the $28 billion figure used in CBC's most recent reporting on the goods covered by the threatened tariffs, and the outcome of legal challenges that are widely expected but have not yet been filed or ruled upon regarding the use of Section 338 itself. Any characterization of who currently holds the upper hand in these talks, whether that comes from a Canadian premier calling the American position weak or from American officials describing progress as strong, reflects the political framing of the person making the claim, not an independently verified fact, and should be treated accordingly. If this is the kind of story where the headline changes overnight, and the real analysis is in tracking how the numbers actually move, not just who claims victory first, that is exactly the kind of update that gets covered here as soon as verified details come out, so it is worth being subscribed before the next deadline hits rather than after. So here is the honest, open question at the center of all of this. When a retaliatory boycott ends up hurting the country that imposed the original tariffs more visibly than the country it targeted, does that count as the tariffs working or as the tariffs backfiring? American distillers and vintners are on record saying it has been a disaster for their businesses. The White House is on record saying the tariffs are a necessary response to discrimination Canada must fix. Both of those things, based on the sourcing gathered here, appear to be simultaneously true. What do you think that means for how this ends? A real lasting deal in Washington, or another temporary patch that gets renegotiated again in a few months? Leave your take in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next update as soon as the facts on this one are confirmed.